Hello everyone, this is the Film Buff Gamer Guy here, and so Atari is releasing the Atari 2600 Plus. It's coming around November 17th. So Atari is still around, but it's really not the same Atari company that revolutionized the video game industry. We wouldn't have Nintendo or Call of Duty without Atari. Because without Atari, we probably won't have a gaming industry, and I probably won't be here making videos like this. So the reason why this Atari, is not the same Atari that made the original 2600 and other stuff is because a company goes out of business and then renames it. A company buys a company and renames it Atari. A company gets bought and renames it Atari. It's just all that confusing legal stuff. All of that shit's confusing. So that's how I can explain it best, that the Atari company that I'm talking about is not the same company that revolutionized the video game industry. So the Atari 2600 Plus comes with 10 games in one multi-cart. The cartridge comes with Adventure, Combat, Dodge'em, Haunted House, Maze Craze, Missile Command, Real Sports Volleyball, Surround, Video Pinball, and DRS Revenge. Those are like the 10 games that in the multi-cart that's come with the Atari 2600 Plus. So, what is the Atari 2600 Plus? Well, it is an HDMI Atari 2600, but an HDMI, and it's made for modern flat screen 4K TVs. That's what the Atari 2600 Plus is made for. And it can also play your older Atari 2600 from games from 40 years ago, and it can also play Atari 7800 games. So I guess they chose to go with the original Atari 2600 look because that system was way more successful than the Atari 7800. So also Atari released other cartridges called Mr. Run and Jump 2600. That just got a cartridge released for the Atari 2600 Plus, and Berserk Enchant's Edition. So, and they have been given ratings by the ESRB, because I'm not saying re-rated because those games came out before the ESRB, before Mortal Kombat and all the other games that came out that created the ESRB, which is pretty funny because imagine if Atari decided to re-release the Atari porn games or release Porky's on the Atari 2600. Like Atari would release Beat 'em and Eat 'em, like where there's a dude jerking his dick and then some naked chicks who are down like to drink the semen. like that's like a really, that might get a rated AO or something if it was released today. But I think how basic the graphics are, that would prevent those games from getting the AO rating and get the rated M rating. So I got to imagine if the Atari porn games were to get re-released with the Atari 2600 Plus. So what is the cost of the Atari 2600 Plus? Well, the new system is going to cost $129, which isn't bad, but I would prefer $100. I get it. It's a system with, it's a new system technically with an HDMI hookup. So I guess $29 isn't that, $129 isn't that bad, but I would I'll at least have it at $9.99. I get it because it's a cartridge system. It's not a console like the NES Classic or SNES Classic or one of those Atari flashback systems by at games or anything. I totally get that. But I would at least prefer $109 or $99.99. That price would work better, at least in my opinion. So the cost of the games that are re-released is that Berserk and Mr. Run and Jump 2600 are both $30, and $30 for Atari games that are piss puddle basic, I think that's way too much. Like, you could get the Atari 50th anniversary collection, and you get a whole bunch of Atari's games in Atari's portfolio around the same price. So I think that $30 is way too extreme for basic Atari games. Which I don't consider buying an Atari 2600 Plus at all. I really don't. At least not on launch day, I don't consider it. But I just find it interesting that Atari is re-releasing an old console from the late 70s and early 80s that actually has the original cartridges. It's not a console like this NES Classic where the games are built in. It actually uses the authentic cartridges, and it runs them on an HDMI system. So I found it interesting that Atari released the Atari 2600 Plus. I find it interesting that that thing exists, and I wonder if the Atari 2600 Plus ever becomes successful, that other consoles like other companies like Nintendo or Sega would re-release their consoles, their older consoles with HDMI. Like Sega re-released the Dreamcast and Sega Genesis with HDMI hookups, and Nintendo re-released their consoles, but with that uses authentic cartridges, and then re-release their older games with the authentic cartridges or discs. Like, I wonder if the Atari 2600 Plus ever becomes successful, that Nintendo, Sega, and Sony with the PlayStation and Xbox, because Microsoft had been in the console wars for around more than 20 years. So, should you get the Atari 2600 Plus? Well, go ahead, go at it, because it would be an interesting experiment if Nintendo, Sega, or PlayStation re-release their consoles and make them feel authentic as humanly possible, instead of just making a console with built-in games or something like that. When I first heard the news about the Atari 2600 Plus, I was scratching my chin. I was like, huh, that's interesting. And I wonder if the Atari 2600 Plus would sell well enough where there will be a bandwagon. And Atari actually released a console in modern times before this called the Atari VCS, which has the same name that the 2600 had in the late 70s. Like, this is the reboot system, and that's just the Atari VCS obviously failed. It ended up being something like the Ouya or the Hyperscan. Failed. One of those failed consoles that tried to get in the console wars with Sony, Microsoft, and Nintendo, and flop. That what Atari's last console ended up being. And Atari is just gonna re-release their older consoles, even though it's not technically theirs. It's only Atari by name. I don't consider getting the Atari 2600 Plus anytime soon. Saving money, I'm just gonna stick with the Atari 50th Anniversary Collection on my PS5. This is the Film Buff Gamer Guy, signing out. Have a good one.